In the early autumn of 1930 in the city of Königsberg, a 24-year-old named Kurt Gödel sat quietly at a small mathematics conference, the kind of man who could pass an entire evening and speak a single sentence. During one of the discussions, he mentioned, almost in passing, that he had a result. He did not raise his voice. He did not call it a bombshell. But in that one quiet remark, he ended the dream that the greatest mathematician alive was about to stand up the very next day and promise the whole world. The dream was certainty. The belief that mathematics could be made complete, that every true thing could be proven, that reason could finally stand on ground reason itself had checked. Godel had just shown, with total rigour, that this is impossible, that any system strong enough to describe itself contains truths it can never reach, and can never even prove that its own reasoning is sound. Not because we are not clever enough, because there is no flaw down there to find. Tonight I want to walk you through it, from the proof that broke Hilbert's fortress in 1931, to the walks home with Einstein in Princeton, to the rotating universe gel built where time bends back into a circle, and finally to a hospital chair 46 years later, where the same man who proved that no system can secure itself from the inside died trapped inside one, unable to reach the single vantage point that would have saved him. By the end, you will see why the shape of his proof and the shape of his death are the same, and why that shape is pointing straight at you. Settle in, because the payoff is the moment you realize the limit Godel found is not about mathematics. It runs through your own mind. If you want more, join our Patreon, Meridian Labs, the membership behind this channel and a few others. Every episode ad-free across all of them, early access before YouTube, and the research archive behind each one. Subscribe or join if you have not. Let's ease into it. On the 29th of December, 1977, one of the most powerful minds in the history of human thought was carried into Princeton Hospital weighing about 65 pounds. That is roughly the weight of a 9-year-old child. The man was 71 years old. He was fully conscious. He was not dying of cancer, or heart failure, or any disease that had crept up on him from the outside. He was dying because he had stopped eating, and he had stopped eating because he had become convinced, with the total certainty of a mathematical proof, that the food being brought to him was poison. The death certificate, when it was finally written, recorded the cause in language that no one who understood this man could read without flinching. Malnutrition and inanition, it said, caused by personality disturbance. 16 days later, he was dead. And the name on that certificate belonged to Kurt Gödel, the logician who, at the age of 25, had proved the single most disorienting theorem in the entire history of mathematics. A theorem that told the human race something about the limits of certainty that we have still not fully absorbed almost a century later. I want you to hold those two facts next to each other, because the whole story lives in the space between them. Here is a man who proved, with absolute rigour, that no system of reasoning powerful enough to describe itself can ever fully secure itself from the inside. And here is that same man, decades later, trapped inside a system of reasoning he could not escape from the inside, starving to death because his own logic had sealed every exit. The proof and the death are the same shape. I am not going to tell you that one caused the other, because that would be a cheap and false thing to say about a real human being who suffered from a real illness. But I am going to show you that the thing he discovered and the thing that killed him are, at their core, the same terrible structure. And by the time we are done, that structure is going to be pointing directly at you. Now, you have probably heard of Godel. Even if you have not, you have almost certainly heard the thing he supposedly said. It gets repeated constantly in dorm rooms and podcasts and the comment sections under videos exactly like this one. Godel proved that nothing can be proven. Godel proved that mathematics is broken. Godel proved that there are truths the human mind can never reach. Gödel proved that logic collapses into paradox and takes all of certainty down with it. Every one of those statements is wrong. Not slightly wrong, not a harmless simplification, wrong in a way that inverts the actual meaning of what he did. The real theorem is more precise than the myth, and once you understand what it actually says, it is far more unsettling than the vague slogan people throw around. The slogan lets you feel a little cosmic shrug and move on. The real thing does not let you move on. It follows you. Here is the version that reached the public, and here is why it was never quite right. The story that got told was that in 1931, a young Austrian showed that mathematics contains contradictions, that the whole edifice is rotten, that we cannot trust our own reasoning. That is not what he proved. What he proved is almost the opposite. He proved that in any consistent formal system rich enough to do basic arithmetic, there will always be statements that are true and that cannot be proven within that system. Not false statements. True ones. Truths that the system can express, that you can see are true if you step outside the system, but that the system itself can never reach from within its own rules. Read that again slowly, because the difference matters more than almost anything else in this story. Mathematics is not broken. Mathematics is not inconsistent. Mathematics is not a house of cards. What Godel showed is that truth is bigger than proof, that the set of things which are true will always permanently outrun the set of things you can prove. There is more truth in the world than any single system of reasoning can ever capture, and there is no fix. You cannot patch it. You cannot add more axioms to close the gap, because the moment you do, the same theorem regenerates the gap one level up. The hole is not a bug in the system. The hole is a feature of what it means to be a system at all, and the people whose entire life's work depended on this not being true had, at that exact moment, just declared victory. I need to take you back to the moment of collision, because the timing of what happened in 1930 is so precise it feels almost staged. In the German city of Niggsburg, in early September of that year, the mathematician David Hilbert, the most respected mathematician alive, was preparing to give a triumphant address. Hilbert had spent decades building toward a single dream. He wanted to place all of mathematics on a foundation so secure that every true statement could, in principle, be proven, every question could be decided, and the whole system could be shown, with certainty, to contain no contradictions. He wanted to close the book on doubt forever. His famous phrase, the one now carved on his gravestone in Göttingen, was a direct answer to anyone who claimed there were things humans could never know. We must know, he said. We will know. He said those words in Niggsburg, and the day before he said them, in that same city, at a small academic conference most of the world has never heard of, a 24-year-old with almost no reputation had stood up during a discussion and quietly mentioned that he had a result. He did not shout it. He did not present it as a bombshell. He mentioned it almost in passing, the way you might mention that it looked like rain. And in that offhand remark, Kurt Gödel had already killed the dream that Hilbert was about to celebrate. Hilbert stood up and told the world we will know. Godel had shown, the day before, that we cannot. That there are things which are true that no amount of knowing will ever let us prove. Almost no one in that room understood what they had just heard. There was exactly one person present who grasped it immediately, and we will get to him, because his reaction is one of the strangest and most honourable moments in the history of science. But for now, hold on to the image. The greatest mathematician of the age, declaring that the door to certainty would be opened, and a young man in the audience the day before who had already, quietly, welded it shut. This is not a story that many people know, and the fact that it never reached you is itself part of the story. Because the real Godel, the actual content of his work and the actual shape of his life, has been sanded down into a set of comfortable slogans that let everyone avoid the part that genuinely disturbs. The version where he proved a clever paradox and then had some mental health problems later in life is the safe version. The safe version is a lie of omission. What actually happened is that a man looked directly at the limits of reason, proved they were real and permanent, and then spent the rest of his life being slowly consumed by a version of that same limit operating inside his own skull. The proof was about formal systems, the death was about a human one, and the bridge between them is the most uncomfortable idea in this entire field. To understand why Hilbert's dream mattered so much, and why its destruction landed like a death in the family across all of European mathematics, you have to understand what had been happening to the foundations of the subject in the decades before. Mathematics had spent the 19th century discovering, to its horror, that it did not actually know what it was standing on. For 2,000 years geometry had rested on Euclid, and Euclid felt like bedrock, like something handed down rather than invented. Then in the 1800s mathematicians found that you could throw out one of Euclid's assumptions, the one about parallel lines, and build entirely different geometries that were just as consistent, just as valid, and completely alien to ordinary intuition. The bedrock turned out to be a choice. And once one piece of the foundation revealed itself as a choice, rather than a law, the natural question became terrifying. What else was a choice? What was actually secure? Was anything? Then came the paradoxes, and the paradoxes were worse. As mathematicians tried to rebuild everything on the clean new foundation of set theory, the idea that every mathematical object could be understood as a collection of things, they kept running into contradictions that seemed to come from nowhere. The most famous was found by Bertrand Russell, and it is simple enough to state at a dinner table. Consider the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Now ask whether that set contains itself. If it does, then by its own definition it does not. If it does not, then by its own definition it does. The question has no consistent answer, and this was not some exotic construction from the far edge of the subject. It sat right at the centre of the most basic tool mathematicians were using to rebuild everything. The foundation was cracking while they poured it. Hilbert's response to all of this was not despair. It was the opposite. It was one of the most ambitious intellectual projects ever attempted. He proposed that mathematics could be made completely safe if you treated it in an entirely new way. Stop thinking about what the symbols mean, he said. Treat mathematics as a formal game played with marks on paper according to fixed rules. You have a starting set of statements, the axioms, and you have rules for deriving new statements from old ones, and a proof is just a finite chain of these mechanical steps. If you do it this way, everything becomes checkable. A proof is either valid or it is not, and you can verify which by inspection, the way you can verify a chess game was played by the rules without needing to know why anyone made the moves they made. And within that framework, Hilbert wanted three things, and he believed all three were within reach. He wanted mathematics to be consistent, meaning it could never prove both a statement and its opposite. He wanted it to be complete, meaning that every true statement could be proven and every question could be settled one way or the other. And he wanted it to be decidable, meaning there could exist a definite procedure, a kind of mechanical crank you could turn that would tell you for any statement whether it was provable. Consistent, complete, decidable, get those three and doubt is banished forever. Mathematics becomes a fortress with no way in for contradiction and no true statement locked outside its walls. He had laid down the challenge publicly decades earlier. In the year 1900, at a mathematical congress in Paris, Hilbert had presented a list of 23 unsolved problems to guide the coming century, and the second problem on that list was to prove that the axioms of arithmetic are consistent. Prove that basic arithmetic, the arithmetic every child learns, can never contradict itself. He thought it was hard, but doable. He thought it was a matter of time and effort. He put the full weight of his reputation behind the conviction that the human mind, working carefully enough, could reach the bottom and find solid ground. In mathematics, he insisted, there is no we shall not know. There is no unsolvable problem. The whole spirit of the thing was a refusal to accept limits on what reason could achieve. Therefore, when a quiet young man from Vienna proved that this was impossible, that no such fortress could ever be built, he was not just refuting a technical conjecture. He was telling the most powerful figure in the field that the dream of his entire life was not merely unfinished, but structurally unreachable. That it had been impossible from the start. And he was doing it with the one weapon Hilbert had insisted on, pure formal rigour, the mechanical certainty that Hilbert himself had held up as the gold standard. Godel did not attack the fortress from outside with vague philosophical doubts. He walked in through the front gate using Hilbert's own rules and proved from the inside that the fortress could never be sealed. Who was he, this young man who arrived with the demolition order? To understand the death at the end of this story, you have to meet the child at the beginning of it, because the thread that runs through the whole life is visible from almost the first years. Kurt Gödel was born on the 28th of April, 1906, in the city of Brno, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and is now Brno, in the Czech Republic. His family was German-speaking and comfortable. His father managed a textile factory. And the boy was strange in the specific way that certain brilliant children are strange, which is that he could not stop asking why. The family nickname for him was Herr Warem, which means Mr. Y. He asked and asked, past the point where the adults had answers, past the point where there were answers at all. A child who wants the reason underneath the reason underneath the reason is a child who will eventually run into the bottom of things. Most of us learn to stop asking before we get there. Godel never learnt to stop. And here is the detail that plants the seed for everything that comes later, and I am telling you this not because it is interesting background, but because it connects directly to how he died. Around the age of 6 or 7, Kurt caught rheumatic fever. He recovered completely. Medically, physically, he was fine. But somewhere in that illness, the boy read or was told that rheumatic fever can damage the heart, and he became convinced that his own heart had been permanently injured. It had not. Every examination for the rest of his life would find nothing wrong. It did not matter. The conviction had taken hold, and it never let go. For the rest of his days he would believe his body was more fragile than the evidence said, would layer himself in warm clothing in summer, would consume medications for conditions no doctor could find. Think about what that is, at its root. A mind so committed to an internal chain of reasoning that it trusts the conclusion over every piece of external evidence that contradicts it. The heart is damaged, the internal logic said, and no examination, no test, no doctor's reassurance, no decade of ordinary health could dislodge it. The premise was false, but the reasoning from the premise was airtight, and so the false conclusion became unshakable. He could not step outside his own certainty to check whether the certainty was warranted. Remember that. It is going to come back, and when it comes back, it is going to be holding a knife. He went to the University of Vienna in 1924, first intending to study physics, then switching to mathematics, drawn toward exactly the questions of logic and foundations that Hilbert had made the centre of the field, and Vienna in the 1920s was one of the great intellectual furnaces of the modern world. Godel fell into the orbit of a group of philosophers and scientists who called themselves the Vienna Circle, thinkers who believed that anything which could not be verified by observation or reduced to logic was literally meaningless. Metaphysics, they said, was noise. Talk of a reality beyond what we can measure was just confusion dressed up in fancy words. Godel sat in those meetings, quiet, brilliant, and he disagreed with almost all of it. Because Godel was a Platonist, and he was a Platonist to the bone, he believed that mathematical objects were real. Not real as a manner of speaking, not real as useful fictions, but real in the fullest sense, more real, arguably, than the chair you are sitting in. He believed that numbers and sets and mathematical truths existed in their own domain, independent of human minds, waiting to be discovered the way explorers discover a coastline that was there all along. The people around him thought mathematics was a language humans invented. Godel thought mathematics was a landscape humans stumbled into. And that difference, which sounds like a dry philosophical footnote, is the hidden engine of everything he did. Because a man who believes that mathematical truth is a real place, out there, larger than any human system, is exactly the man who might notice that the place is bigger than any map we could ever draw of it. He kept his deepest views largely to himself. He was, by every account, extraordinarily reserved, precise in speech to the point of discomfort. A man who would sit silently through an entire evening and then say one sentence that reorganized the conversation. But underneath the silence, he was building something, and by the end of the 1920s, he had turned his attention to Hilbert's fortress, to the dream of a complete and consistent and decidable mathematics, and he had begun to suspect that the dream was not just hard, but impossible. The question was how to prove it. How do you prove, using mathematics itself, that mathematics can never be finished? How do you get a system to talk about its own limits? That problem is where the real horror begins. The trick Godel found is so audacious that when you first understand it, it feels like a magician has pulled something out of a hat that could not possibly have fit inside. Logicians who have studied it for decades still describe the central move as having the quality of a rabbit produced from nowhere. And the strange thing is that the seed of it is a paradox children already know. Consider the sentence, "This sentence is false." If it is true, then what it says holds, which means it is false. If it is false, then what it says fails, which means it is true. It flips endlessly and lands nowhere. This is the liar paradox, and for thousands of years it was treated as a curiosity, a party trick of language. The kind of thing you notice at 15 and then set aside as a quirk of how words can twist back on themselves. Nobody thought it had anything to do with the solid, serious business of mathematical proof. Mathematics dealt in numbers and quantities. It did not deal in sentences about themselves. Godel's genius was to see that this was not a barrier, but a bridge, and to find the way across it. He realized that if he could make mathematics talk about itself, if he could build a sentence inside the language of arithmetic that referred to its own probability, then he could smuggle the liar paradox into the fortress and detonate it. Not this sentence is false, which is about truth and leads only to confusion, but this sentence cannot be proven, which is about proof and leads somewhere far more precise and far more devastating. The problem was that arithmetic does not, on its face, talk about sentences. It talks about numbers. 2 plus 2, the square of 7, whether a number is prime. There is no obvious way for an equation about integers to say anything about itself, because an equation is not a number, and provability is not a quantity. Godel's solution to this was the piece of the puzzle that took the world's breath away, and it is worth walking through slowly, because the detail is the content. He built a code. Every symbol in the formal language of mathematics, every plus sign, every equal sign, every variable, every logical connective, he assigned a number. Then every formula, which is just a string of symbols, could be assigned a single number of its own, built out of the numbers of its symbols in a specific and reversible way, using prime factorizations so that no two different formulas could ever produce the same code, and any code could be uniquely decoded back into the formula that made it. And then, crucially, an entire proof, which is a sequence of formulas, could itself be encoded as a single enormous number. Every statement in mathematics now had a number. Every proof in mathematics now had a number. The whole activity of doing mathematics had been translated into facts about the integers. This is the move, because now a statement about numbers could secretly be a statement about mathematics. A claim like this number is not the code of any valid proof of that formula, is, on its surface, a dry arithmetical claim about the relationship between two integers. But decoded, It means something explosive. It means that formula has no proof. Godel had found a way for arithmetic to describe its own inner workings, to reach back and grab hold of itself. Mathematics could now, in a completely rigorous way, make statements about what mathematics could and could not do. And then he assembled the bomb. Using this coding, Godel constructed with total precision a specific mathematical statement. Call it G, and when you decode what G actually says, using Godel's own translation, it says this. G is not provable within this system. It is a statement of arithmetic, a perfectly well-formed claim about numbers that when you read it through the code turns out to be asserting its own unprovability. The sentence points at itself and says, "You will never prove me." Now watch what happens, because this is the whole game, and it closes like a trap with no way out. Suppose the system could prove G. Then the system has proven a statement which says it cannot be proven. That means the system has proven something false, which means the system is inconsistent, which means it is worthless, because an inconsistent system can prove anything at all, including outright contradictions. Therefore, if we are dealing with a consistent system, one worth caring about, it cannot prove G. But wait, G says exactly that G cannot be proven, and we have just shown that G cannot be proven, which means G is true. We are looking at a statement that is true, that we can see is true, standing right here outside the system, and the system itself can never prove it. That is the first incompleteness theorem. In any consistent formal system powerful enough to express basic arithmetic, there exists a statement that is true but unprovable within the system, and it is not a weird edge case that you could legislate away. Godel handed you the exact statement. He built it in front of you, and the horror is that you cannot escape by adding G as a new axiom, because the moment you do, the machinery runs again and produces a new statement, G prime, which is true and unprovable in the new larger system, and then G double prime above that. Forever, there is no final system. There is no complete book. Every time you think you have caught all the truths you have not caught assemble themselves into a new statement that slips through your fingers. I want to stop here because this is exactly the point where the popular story goes wrong, and where you get to know something that almost everyone who invokes Godel gets backward. The mistake people make is to hear all of this and conclude that mathematics is unreliable, that because there are unprovable truths, we cannot trust our proofs, that certainty is dead, that anything goes. This is precisely wrong, and it is worth being angry at how often it is repeated by people who should know better. Godel did not show that mathematics is inconsistent. He assumed consistency and worked forward from it. He did not show that our proofs are untrustworthy. Every valid proof is exactly as valid as it ever was. He did not show that truth is relative or that logic collapses. It was not that mathematics had failed, it was that mathematics had turned out to be larger than any cage that could ever be built to hold it. The truths kept overflowing the walls, not because the walls were badly built, but because there is no wall high enough. Truth is simply a bigger thing than proof, permanently, and Godel is the man who measured the exact size of the gap between them and found it to be infinite. And here is the piece of secret knowledge that inoculates you against the noise forever, the boundary that shows this is precise engineering and not vague mysticism. The theorem does not apply to everything. It applies only to systems that are powerful enough to express the full arithmetic of the whole numbers, including both addition and multiplication. Take multiplication away, and something remarkable happens. Just 1 year before Godell's result, a logician named Moses Presburger proved that the arithmetic of the whole numbers with addition alone, no multiplication, is complete and consistent and decidable. Every true statement in it can be proven. There is a mechanical procedure that settles every question. It is exactly the fortress Hilbert dreamed of. It fully exists. It is just that it lives in a world too weak to describe itself, and the price of that safety is that it can never be strong enough to do real mathematics. That is the knife edge the whole thing balances on, and it is beautiful in a way that should also frighten you. The power to describe yourself and the power to secure yourself are in direct opposition. A system simple enough to be completely proven is too simple to talk about itself. A system rich enough to talk about itself is automatically rich enough to contain a statement it cannot prove. Self-reference is the exact thing that opens the wound. The moment a system becomes complex enough to model itself, to represent its own operations inside itself, it becomes incapable of fully verifying itself. Complexity and self-knowledge come bundled with permanent uncertainty, and there is no upgrade that removes it. Sit with that principle for a moment, phrased as plainly as I can put it. Any system complex enough to reason about itself is too complex to fully trust itself. Hold that sentence. Do not let it stay abstract. Because in a little while I am going to introduce you to a system that was complex enough to reason about itself, that was in fact one of the most powerful reasoning systems that has ever existed, and you already know its name, and you already know how it ended. There was one person in that Königsberg room who understood immediately, and his name was John von Neumann. If you know that name, you know it belongs to one of the fastest and most versatile minds of the 20th century, a man who made foundational contributions to quantum mechanics, to economics, to the design of the computer you are almost certainly holding or sitting near right now. Von Neumann was not a man who was easily impressed, because very little moved faster than he did. But when Godel made his quiet remark during that discussion, von Neumann grasped what it meant while nearly everyone else in the room was still nodding along politely, and he went to Godel afterward to talk it through. And then something happened that tells you everything about the caliber of both men. Von Neumann went home and kept thinking about Godel's result, and he worked out a consequence of it that Godel had mentioned but not yet fully developed. He realized that if you follow the first theorem to its natural conclusion, you reach a second, and the second is arguably worse. On the 20th of November, 1930, von Neumann wrote to Godel, excited to share what he had found. A system like this, he had realized, cannot prove its own consistency. But by the time the letter arrived, Godel had already gotten there himself. He had already written it up. His paper, containing both theorems, had been received by the journal 3 days earlier, on the 17th of November. Von Neumann, upon learning this, did something that almost no one at that level of ego and achievement would do. He stepped back completely. He said the result was Godel's, that Godel had priority, and he never published his own version. His proof of the second theorem, worked out independently by one of the great minds of the age, simply vanished into a drawer, because he decided the credit belonged to someone else. From that point on, he became one of Godel's most vocal champions, telling people that Godel was the greatest logician since Aristotle. And here is a detail that should tell you how genuinely hard this was for even the finest minds to swallow. When the result began to circulate, it was met in several quarters, not with applause, but with confusion, resistance, and in at least one case open hostility from a man who should have been perfectly equipped to grasp it. Ernst Zermelo was one of the founders of modern set theory, one of the most important logicians alive, the man whose axioms still underpin the foundations of mathematics today. And when Zermelo encountered Godel's proof, he decided it was wrong. He believed he had found a fatal flaw. He wrote to Godel insisting that the argument contained a gap, that it collapsed under scrutiny, that the young man had made an error. What had actually happened was that Zermelo had misunderstood the distinction at the very heart of the thing, the distinction between truth and provability that the entire proof depends on. He was reading his own assumptions into it and finding a contradiction that was not there, and Godel's response is a small window into the kind of person he was. He did not fire back with contempt. He wrote Zermelo a long, patient, meticulous letter, walking through the argument step by step, explaining exactly where the older man had gone wrong, laying out the logic with the same care he would give to a proof. It did not fully work. Zermelo remained largely unconvinced, unable or unwilling to let go of his objection, and that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is a preview of the whole pattern of how this result would be received for the next century. Here was one of the most qualified people on Earth to evaluate the proof, and the proof was so counterintuitive, so hostile to the deep assumptions everyone carried about how mathematics must work, that he reached for the conclusion that it must be broken rather than accept what it said, if Zermelo could not fully absorb it. Think about what happened when the result filtered out into the wider world through people with 1/100th of his understanding. The misreadings were not a later corruption. They started immediately at the highest level among the people best positioned to know better. The truth was simply too strange, and strange truths get rejected or softened or misremembered, because the alternative is to change your picture of reality, and almost no one wants to do that. The paper that came out of all this appeared in 1931 in a German mathematical journal under a title that translates to On Formally Undecidable Propositions of Principia Mathematica and Related Systems. It ran to about 26 pages. 26 pages from a man of 25, and it ended a program that the greatest mathematician alive had staked his life's work on. And the second theorem inside it is the one I need you to really feel, because it is the one that will follow us to the end. The second incompleteness theorem says this: any consistent formal system powerful enough to do arithmetic cannot prove its own consistency. Let me make sure the strangeness of that lands. Consistency is the one thing Hilbert wanted above all others, the guarantee that the system will never contradict itself, never prove both a thing and its opposite, never collapse into the state where everything is provable and nothing means anything. And Gödel showed that a system can never establish this about itself from the inside. If the system is actually consistent, then it cannot prove that it is. The only systems that can prove their own consistency are the ones that are inconsistent, because an inconsistent system can prove everything, including the false reassurance that it is fine. A healthy system cannot certify its own health. A sick one will cheerfully hand you a clean bill. Read that again, because it is one of the most vertiginous facts ever established by human beings. You cannot trust a system that says it is consistent, because if it is telling the truth, it should not have been able to prove that. And if it proved it, then it is lying. The very act of a system declaring itself sound is evidence that something is wrong. To know that your reasoning is trustworthy, you would have to step outside your reasoning and check it from some higher vantage point. But that higher vantage point is just a bigger system, and it cannot verify itself either, and there is no top. There is never a place you can stand where you finally get to confirm that the ground under you is solid. You can always go up one more level. You can never reach the level that certifies all the others. This is the abdication that the entire field has spent almost a century learning to live with quietly, and the way it learned to live with it is itself part of the story. Because you might expect that a result this shattering would have caused an open crisis, a public reckoning, decades of anguished debate about what mathematics even is. Instead, mathematics did something very human. It absorbed the blow and moved on. It filed the incompleteness theorems under interesting rather than under devastating, and it went back to work, because there was work to be done, and the theorems, for all their depth, did not actually stop anyone from doing ordinary mathematics. The gap Godel found is real, but for the day-to-day business of proving theorems, it almost never bites. The profession made a kind of peace by not looking directly at the thing. Hilbert himself, by most accounts, did not take it gracefully at first. He was reportedly angry, and you can understand why. A young man had walked in and proven that the mountain he had spent his life climbing had no summit. The formalist dream did not die in a single dramatic moment. It died the way most dreams die, slowly, with people quietly adjusting their expectations downward and no longer mentioning the thing they used to hope for. Within a few years, the ambition to prove mathematics complete and self-certifying had simply evaporated from the field, replaced by a more modest and more honest understanding of what foundations could ever provide. The fortress was never going to be sealed, so people stopped trying to seal it and learned to live inside a structure that would always, somewhere, be open to the sky. And here is a version of the same institutional pattern that should genuinely bother you, because it is still happening. The incompleteness theorems are to this day among the most misrepresented results in all of science. They get dragged out to prove that God exists and to prove that God cannot exist, to prove that the human mind is more than a machine, and to prove that nothing can ever be known, to justify postmodern claims that all truth is relative, and to justify mystical claims that reality is beyond logic. Almost none of these invocations survive contact with what the theorems actually say. The precise, disciplined, devastating real result gets buried under a landfill of comfortable misreadings. And the misreadings persist because they let people feel they have understood something profound without doing the work of understanding the actual thing. The real theorem is harder and stranger and does not flatter anyone, and so the myth thrives and the truth sits quietly underneath it, exactly as it has since 1931, waiting for someone to look. And if some part of you is still hoping there is an escape hatch, that maybe the proof had a loophole, that maybe some clever mathematician eventually found the flaw and quietly repaired the fortress after all, I have to take that hope away from you too. Because the opposite happened. The result did not weaken over time. It got stronger. In 1936, an American logician named Barclay Rosser found a way to sharpen Godel's first theorem so that it required even less to get going than Godel had needed. Godel's original argument leaned on a technical assumption slightly stronger than plain consistency. Rosser showed you could drop that and get the same devastating conclusion from the bare minimum, from nothing more than the assumption that the system does not contradict itself. The wound got wider, not narrower. And in the near century since, the theorem has been reproven in dozens of independent ways, from dozens of different starting points, by people actively looking for cracks. It has been recast in the language of computability, in the language of information theory, in the language of formal provability itself. Every single time it holds. It is, by a wide margin, one of the most thoroughly stress-tested results in the history of human thought, and it has never so much as flexed. This is bedrock, not a fragile curiosity balanced on a clever trick. It is more certain than almost anything you believe about the physical world, because it is not an observation that could be overturned by better instruments, but a proof, and the proof is correct, and its correctness is itself one of the things we are most sure of. That is the part people do not feel when they wave the theorem around as a vague metaphor. They treat it as a poetic suggestion that maybe knowledge has limits. It is no vague suggestion, but a locked door, welded, tested, and reinforced for nearly 100 years, and on the other side of it is every dream anyone has ever had of a reasoning system that can finally, completely secure itself. That dream is dead. It has been dead since 1931, and the man who killed it was about to spend the next 46 years discovering, in the most intimate way imaginable, what it means to live inside a system that cannot reach its own ground. But there is a deeper reason the second theorem matters here, and I am going to say it now as a shadow and then let it go, because we are not ready for it yet. Godel proves that no sufficiently powerful system can confirm its own consistency from the inside, that it can never, by its own operations, guarantee that its own reasoning is sound. Now, a human mind is a system that reasons. A human mind is powerful enough to model itself, to think about its own thinking, to represent its own operations inside itself, which raises a question that Godel himself would spend the rest of his life being unable to escape, though he never framed it this way, and I am not claiming he did. If no system can verify its own soundness from within, then what happens to a mind that comes to believe something false at the level of its founding assumptions? What happens when the axioms themselves are corrupted? The reasoning from the axioms can be flawless, airtight, unassailable, and every conclusion can follow with perfect logical necessity, and the whole edifice can still be pointing at something that is not there, and the mind inside it has no way, from the inside, to check the axioms against reality. It cannot step outside itself to see that the ground is missing. It can only keep reasoning, perfectly, toward a conclusion that will kill it. Hold that. We will get to the man it happened to. First, there is the strangest chapter of his life, the one that almost no one connects to any of this. The years when Kurt Gödel walked the most famous garden paths in the world beside the most famous scientist of the century, and quietly proved that time itself might be a circle. The 1930s were closing in around Vienna, and they were closing in around Godel personally at the same time. The mind that could reason its way to the bottom of mathematics was not built for the world that was arriving. In 1936, the philosopher Moritz Schlick, the founder of the Vienna Circle and one of the intellectual figures closest to Godel's early career, was shot dead on the steps of the University of Vienna by a former student. The murder was, in part, wrapped up in the poisonous politics of the era, and the killer would later be released and celebrated by the Nazis. For Godel, the effect was catastrophic. He had already suffered breakdowns earlier in the decade, stays in sanatoria, episodes of depression that pulled him out of work for months at a time. The killing of Schlick pushed him into a severe crisis. He became, for the first time in a documented way, afraid of being poisoned. That fear, which appears in the record in the 1930s as a response to violence and upheaval, would never fully leave him again. It would wait, and it would grow. There was one force holding him to the world through all of this, and her name was Adele. Adele Nimbursky, born poor Kurt, was a dancer he had met years earlier at a Viennese nightclub called Der Nachtfalter, which means the moth. She was 6 years older than him. She had been married before. She came from a different and lower social world than his respectable bourgeois family, and his parents disapproved of her completely. Godel married her anyway, in September of 1938. It was one of the few decisions in his life driven by something other than pure logic, and it may have been the one that kept him alive for another 40 years. Adele was warm where he was cold, physical where he was abstract, fiercely protective of a husband who could not protect himself. There is a story that she once drove off a group of thugs who were harassing him in the street by swinging her handbag at them. Whether or not every detail of that story is exact, it captures something true. She stood between Godel and a world he could not manage. And decades later, when the fear of poison finally consumed him, it would be Adele who kept him eating, because she was the only person on earth whose food he trusted. When the Nazis annexed Austria in 1938, Godel's position in Vienna evaporated. The academic title he had held was abolished in the reorganization, and worse, he was examined and found fit for Nazi military service. A man of his fragility, his abstraction, his barely managed anxiety, was about to be conscripted into the German army. He and Adele had to get out, and the way they got out is one of the strangest travel stories in the history of science, because they could not simply sail west across the Atlantic. The safer route, absurdly, ran the other direction, all the way around the world. In early 1940, the couple boarded the Trans-Siberian Railway and crossed the entire breadth of the Soviet Union, thousands of miles of frozen emptiness, to reach the Pacific coast. From there they sailed to Japan, and from Japan they crossed the ocean to San Francisco, arriving in March of 1940, and then took a train across the United States to the town that would hold him for the rest of his life. Princeton, New Jersey. At the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, Godel found the closest thing to a sanctuary he would ever have, and he found something even rarer than that. He found a friend. And not just any friend. The man who became his closest companion during the Princeton years, the man he walked home with, almost every day, was Albert Einstein. It is one of the great pairings in intellectual history, and it was, by all accounts, genuine and deep. Every day the two men would walk together between the institute and their homes, two heavily accented German speakers, deep in conversation about physics and mathematics and philosophy and the state of the world. Einstein was gregarious and famous and comfortable in his own legend. Godel was withdrawn and precise and almost pathologically private. They should not have fit, and yet they fit completely. The economist Oscar Morgenstern, who knew them both, recorded a remark that Einstein made near the end of his life, and it is one of the most touching sentences ever spoken by one genius about another. Einstein said that his own work no longer meant much to him, and that he came to the Institute mainly in order to have the privilege of walking home with Godel. The most famous scientist who ever lived said that the reason he went to work was to walk home with Kurt Gödel. And here the pattern of Dell's mind, the pattern we have been tracing since the boy who trusted his internal conviction over every doctor, reveals itself in a new and telling form. Because Gödel did not treat Einstein's own theory as settled scripture, he looked at general relativity, Einstein's crowning achievement, the theory of how gravity bends space and time, and he did with it what he did with everything. He followed the logic to a place no one else had dared to go. In 1949, as a birthday gift for Einstein, Godel produced a solution to the equations of general relativity that described a rotating universe. And in that rotating universe, the equations permitted something that should not be permitted. They permitted closed loops in time, paths through space-time that curve all the way back to their own starting point. In Godel's universe, you could, in principle, travel into your own past. Einstein's equations, taken at face value, allowed for time travel, not as science fiction, but as a mathematically valid solution to the actual field equations of the actual theory. Godel had found it by trusting the mathematics over the intuition, the same way he always did. Our universe, as far as we can tell, does not rotate the way his model requires, so his particular solution is not a description of the world we live in. But that was never quite the point for Godel. The point was that the equations did not forbid it. And if the fundamental laws of physics do not forbid the past from being revisited, then what exactly does time even mean? Godel took this seriously in a way almost no one else did. He came to believe that the passage of time, the flow from past to future that feels like the most undeniable fact of our existence, might be an illusion. That if time can loop, then the intuitive picture of a moving present marching forward is not built into reality at all. It is something happening in us, not in the world. Look at what this man kept doing, over and over across every domain he touched. In mathematics, he trusted the formal system and discovered that truth outruns proof. In physics, he trusted the equations and discovered that time might not flow. In his own body, decades earlier, he had trusted an internal chain of reasoning and concluded his heart was failing when it was not. The method never changed. Follow the logic, trust the structure, believe the conclusion even when the conclusion violates every ordinary intuition and every piece of surface evidence. That method made him perhaps the deepest logician who ever lived. It let him see things the whole rest of the species had missed. And it was, at the same time, the exact mechanism that would eventually turn on him and close around his throat. There is a famous episode from this period that shows how completely the man lived inside his own reasoning, and it would be funny if it were not also a warning. In 1947, Godel prepared to take his examination for United States citizenship. To get ready, he did what Godel did with everything. He studied the object in front of him with total seriousness. He read the United States Constitution closely, more closely probably, than the officials who administer the citizenship test have ever read it. And in the course of that reading, applying his logician's eye to the document, Godel became convinced that he had discovered an internal inconsistency, a logical flaw in the structure of the Constitution itself, a loophole through which, he believed, The country could be legally transformed into a dictatorship without ever formally breaking its own rules. The main account of what happened next comes from Morgenstern, who was there, so we should hold the exact details lightly, but the shape of it is well attested. Einstein and Morgenstern accompanied Gödel to his hearing as witnesses, and on the drive there, they grew increasingly worried, because Gödel would not stop talking about his discovery, and they were terrified he would raise it in front of the judge and derail the entire proceeding, perhaps even get himself denied citizenship. According to Morgenstern, when the judge, in a friendly way, remarked that at least the United States could never fall into the kind of dictatorship that had swallowed Gödel's homeland, Gödel began to insist that on the contrary he could prove it could happen, that he had found exactly how. Einstein and the judge managed to steer him away from delivering a full logical demonstration of the fragility of American democracy in the middle of his own citizenship hearing. He was granted citizenship, and the specific loophole he thought he had found, he never wrote down clearly, so we do not entirely know what he saw. But notice, again, the shape. Gödel looked at the founding document of a nation and could not see the crack in its logic, the place where the system, following its own rules, could betray itself. He saw it in mathematics. He saw it in the Constitution. He could not stop seeing the fault line where a system turns against itself, and the last system he would ever analyse that way was his own mind. The Princeton years were not only strange walks and constitutional loopholes, they were also the years in which Gödel did his second great piece of work, and it landed in exactly the place you would now expect. It landed on another question that a system cannot answer about itself. The question came from the theory of infinity, and it is older than Gödel. In the late 19th century, the mathematician Georg Cantor had proven something that broke people's minds and, in Cantor's own case, may have contributed to breaking the man. He proved that there are different sizes of infinity. The infinity of the whole counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, on forever, is a smaller infinity than the infinity of all the points on a line. There are more real numbers than there are counting numbers, even though both sets are endless. Infinity is not a single thing. It comes in a tower of ever larger magnitudes. And Cantor asked a simple-sounding question about that tower. Is there a size of infinity in between those two? Larger than the counting numbers but smaller than the line? Or is the line the very next step up with nothing in the gap? The guess that there is nothing in between is called the Continuum hypothesis. Cantor believed it. He could not prove it. It tormented him for the rest of his life, and he died in a sanatorium, poor and largely forgotten, his greatest ideas still fought over. Gödel took up the Continuum hypothesis at Princeton, and in 1940 he proved something precise, and by now familiar in its shape. He proved that you cannot disprove the Continuum hypothesis using the standard axioms of set theory. He did it by building an entire miniature mathematical universe, a carefully constructed inner world containing only the sets you are logically forced to admit, and showing that inside that world the Continuum hypothesis holds true. The hypothesis therefore could not be false as a matter of pure logic from the axioms. Decades later, in 1963, a young mathematician named Paul Cohen proved the other half. He showed that you also cannot prove the Continuum hypothesis from those same axioms. Put the two results together, and you get something that should sound extremely familiar by now. The Continuum hypothesis is undecidable. The standard foundations of mathematics can neither prove it nor disprove it. The question of whether there is a size of infinity hiding in that gap is a question the system simply cannot answer. It is a true Gödelian hole, sitting right in the middle of our theory of the infinite, and we cannot fill it from where we stand. For almost anyone else, that would be the end of the story. The axioms cannot decide it, therefore there is no fact of the matter, therefore the question is empty, a quirk of the formalism with no real answer. But Gödel refused that conclusion completely, and the reason he refused it is the deepest key to who he was. Gödel believed the continuum hypothesis has a definite answer. He believed it is either true or false, actually, out there, as a fact about the real landscape of mathematical infinity. The fact that our current axioms cannot reach that answer, he said, is not a statement about infinity. It is a statement about the poverty of our axioms. Our map is incomplete. The territory is real. There is a truth up there in the Tower of Infinities, and it is waiting, and our failure to prove it means only that we have not yet found the right way to see it. Truth, for Gödel, was never the same thing as proof. Proof was the human, limited, formal shadow. Truth was the real object casting it, larger than any shadow, existing whether or not we ever catch up to it. This is a man, remember, who believed that mathematical objects were more real than physical ones. The astrophysicist John Bacall once introduced himself to Gödel as a physicist, and Gödel replied, flatly, that he did not believe in natural science. Think about what a strange thing that is to say and mean. Here was someone for whom the abstract realm of numbers and sets and pure logical form was the solid ground, and the physical world of matter and measurement and bodies was the flimsy, doubtful secondary thing. Ordinary intuition runs the other way. It trusts the table you can knock on and grows unsure about abstractions. Godel trusted the abstractions and felt unsure about the table, and that inversion, that fundamental reversal of what counts as real and what counts as doubtful, is the thread I need you to keep hold of, because it runs directly into the darkness at the end. Because Godel did not stop at mathematics, he turned the same faculty, the same total trust, in what reason could reach beyond the senses, onto the largest questions there are. Sometime around 1941, he wrote out a formal proof of the existence of God, not a poem, not a meditation, not a vague argument. A rigorous logical derivation, written in the symbolic language of modal logic, taking a small set of axioms about what it means for a property to be positive and deriving, step by mechanical step, that a being possessing all positive properties necessarily exists. It descends from a line of arguments going back through Leibniz to the medieval philosopher Anselm, but Gödel did it with the tools of 20th century logic, and he guarded it privately for almost 30 years. He showed it to a colleague, the logician Dana Scott, only around 1970. When he believed he might be dying and wanted the argument to survive him, he was always careful to say that he was investigating whether such a proof was logically possible, not simply announcing his faith. But the impulse tells you everything. Godel believed reason could reach God the same way it could reach the truth about infinity, as a real object out there that careful enough logic could arrive at. And he believed the same about the survival of the soul. In a series of letters to his mother Marianne, written in 1961, Godel argued, seriously and at length, for life after death. His argument was not based on scripture or feeling, it was based on reason. If the world is rationally organized and has meaning, he wrote to her, then there must be another life, because it would make no sense for a being to be created with such vast unrealized potential, capable of so much learning and development and connection, only to be extinguished having achieved almost none of it. A rational universe would not waste us like that. Therefore, he reasoned, there must be a continuation. He described himself, when pressed on his whole outlook, in 4 words: rationalistic, idealistic, optimistic, and theological. He read the Bible in bed on Sunday mornings, his wife said after his death, though he never went to church. He believed in a personal God. And he believed it, as he believed everything, because he had reasoned his way there and trusted the reasoning over the silence of the visible world. I find this the most moving and the most frightening part of the whole story, and I want to be honest that I do not know how to fully hold it. Here is a man using the greatest logical mind of his century to reach, by pure reason, past everything the senses can confirm, toward truths he was certain were real, toward infinities we cannot prove, toward a God we cannot see, toward a life beyond the one we can measure. and the very same movement of mind, the total confidence that internal reasoning can outrun external evidence, was already, quietly, turning in a darker direction. Because if reason can be trusted past the evidence to reach God, then reason can also be trusted past the evidence to reach a conclusion that no one is there to bring you food that has not been poisoned. The faculty is the same. The trust is the same. The refusal to let mere physical appearances override the internal certainty is exactly the same. It reached toward heaven with one hand and toward starvation with the other, and it could not tell the difference. Because from the inside, there is no difference. Airtight reasoning from a corrupted premise feels identical to airtight reasoning from a true one. That is the whole horror, and Gödel proved it about mathematics before it came for him. There is one more thread from the Princeton years I have to pull, because it shows the pattern we have been tracing crossing quietly from his genius into something darker years before the end, in a domain that had nothing to do with his body. It has to do with a dead philosopher. For much of his life, Godel was obsessed with Gottfried Leibniz, the 17th century polymath who, among 100 other things, had dreamed of a universal logical language in which every dispute could be settled by calculation. You can see why Godel loved him. Leibniz had imagined exactly the kind of perfect reasoning machine that Hilbert later chased, and that Godel proved impossible. Godel studied Leibniz intensely, filled notebooks with him, but somewhere in that study, his reading took a turn that his colleagues found alarming. Godel became convinced that some of Leibniz's most important writings had been deliberately destroyed or hidden, not lost to the ordinary accidents of history, but suppressed, on purpose, by people who did not want Leibniz's discoveries to reach the world. He believed there had been in effect a conspiracy across the centuries to keep certain ideas buried. The mathematician Carl Menger, who knew him well, recorded his unease at hearing Gödel talk this way. He would point out to Gödel that plenty of Leibniz had obviously survived, that it was strange to imagine some organised effort to erase him. And Godel would counter that the very survival of so much was itself suspicious. That if ordinary forces had been at work, even more would have come down to us, so the gaps had to be the fingerprints of deliberate concealment. Notice the structure of that argument, because it is the same structure that would later kill him. Every piece of evidence, including evidence that pointed the other way, got absorbed into the theory and made to confirm it. The abundance of surviving Leibniz did not weaken the belief in suppression. It strengthened it. There was no possible observation that could have countered against the conclusion, because the conclusion had learned to feed on everything, including its own apparent refutation. That is what a corrupted premise does once the reasoning around it is powerful enough. It becomes unfalsifiable, not through stupidity, but through an excess of intelligence turned in a closed loop. This was the same man, in the same years, doing the most rigorous logic on the planet. The faculty that let him see the real, permanent fault line in mathematics was the identical faculty now beginning to see fault lines that were not there, hidden hands behind the missing manuscripts. Conspiracies woven into the historical record. The genius and the paranoia were not two different Godels. They were one mind applying one method. The total trust in an internal chain of inference over any external reassurance, to targets where it revealed the deepest truths, and to targets where it manufactured phantoms. And from the inside, as we will see, there was no way for him to tell which was which. The Leibniz conspiracy felt exactly as certain as the incompleteness theorem. Both were the output of the same relentless, brilliant, unbreakable engine. There is a question sitting underneath everything I've told you, and it is time to bring it into the open, because it is the question that turns this from a story about a dead mathematician into a story about you. The question is this: is a human mind a formal system? Because if it is, then everything Godel proved about formal systems applies to it. And if it is not, then there is something in you that no machine and no logic can ever capture. Godel himself thought about this constantly, and the argument that grew out of it is one of the most contested and consequential in the whole philosophy of mind. Here is the seductive version of the argument, the one that has launched 1,000 late-night conversations. When you look at a Godel sentence, the statement G that says of itself that it cannot be proven within the system, you, a human being, can see that it is true. You can stand outside the formal system and grasp clearly that G is true precisely because it cannot be proven. But the system itself can never do that. The system is trapped. It can never reach G. It looks, at first glance, as though the human mind can do something no formal system can do. It can see truths that no mechanical procedure could ever prove. And if that is right, then the mind is not a machine. There is a spark in human understanding that transcends computation, that reaches truths algorithms cannot reach. The philosopher John Lucas argued exactly this in the 1960s, and decades later the physicist Roger Penrose built on it in 2 enormously influential books. Arguing that human consciousness must involve something beyond ordinary computation, perhaps something reaching down into unknown physics. It is a thrilling argument. It flatters something deep in us, the sense that we are more than mechanism, that there is a ghost in the machine that the machine can never contain. And it uses the most rigorous result in logic to say so. When people invoke Godel to prove that the human spirit transcends the computer, this is the argument they are reaching for, whether they know its name or not. And here is where I have to do the uncomfortable thing, because the honest picture is more complicated than the thrilling one, and this audience deserves the honest picture. The consensus among logicians who have examined this argument carefully is that it does not work, at least not in the clean, triumphant form people want. And the reason it does not work goes straight back to the second incompleteness theorem, the one about a system being unable to prove its own consistency. Look again at what you actually did when you looked at G and saw it was true. You did not see unconditionally that G is true. What you saw was that if the system is consistent, then G is true. Your insight was conditional. It depended entirely on assuming the system does not contradict itself. And that assumption, the assumption of consistency, is exactly the thing that Godel proved a system cannot establish about itself. And when you claim you can see the truth of your own Godel sentence in a way a machine cannot, you are quietly assuming your own consistency. You are assuming that your own reasoning does not secretly contradict itself somewhere. But you cannot prove that. By Godel's own second theorem, if you are a consistent system, you cannot prove you are one. And if you are not consistent, then your ability to see all sorts of things is worthless, because an inconsistent system can convince itself of anything. The logician Solomon Pfefferman, who examined Penrose's version of the argument in detail, concluded that it fails to establish what it claims, and he was not even a defender of the idea that minds are machines. He simply followed the logic. The trap closes on the human exactly the way it closes on the formal system. You want to stand outside yourself and certify that your own reasoning is sound. You cannot. There is no outside to stand in. To verify your own consistency, you would have to step up to a higher system, and that system cannot verify itself either, and there is no top. The very move that was supposed to prove you transcend the machine turns out to be the move you are forbidden from making, for the exact reason the machine is forbidden from making it. Godel himself was far more careful than Lucas or Penrose, and his own conclusion is subtler and, in a way, more unsettling. In a lecture he gave in 1951, he laid out not a proof that the mind beats the machine, but a fork in the road. Either, he said, the human mind surpasses every finite machine, or there exist mathematical truths that are absolutely unknowable to us, problems no human being will ever solve. One or the other must be true, he argued, but his theorems could not tell us which. He leaned personally toward the first horn, toward the mind being more than mechanism, because he was a Platonist, and he believed the human mind could perceive mathematical reality directly. But he admitted he could not prove it. He left it as a disjunction, a genuine unresolved fork, and he was too honest to pretend the fork had been settled. Sit inside that fork for a moment, because it is a genuinely terrible place to be, and it is where we actually live. Option 1. Your mind is more than any machine, capable of reaching truths no mechanical procedure can reach, which sounds wonderful until you notice it means you can never fully explain or verify your own understanding, because it exceeds any system you could write down. Option 2. Your mind is a formal system after all, in which case Godel's theorems apply to you directly, in which case there are truths you can never reach, and worse, you can never prove from the inside that your own reasoning is even consistent. Either you are more than a machine, and therefore beyond your own comprehension, or you are a machine, and therefore subject to Godel's blade. There is no third door where you get to be a machine that fully understands and certifies itself. That door does not exist. Godel welded it shut in 1931, and nobody has found a way to open it since. And whichever horn is true, one conclusion survives on both. You cannot, from inside your own mind, guarantee that your own mind is sound. If you are a formal system, the second theorem forbids it directly. If you are more than a formal system, then you are something you cannot fully model or check, even in principle. On both branches, the same thing holds. There is no vantage point inside you from which you can confirm that the whole apparatus is working correctly, that your premises are true, that your reasoning has not gone quietly wrong somewhere below the level you can inspect. You are running on foundations you did not choose and cannot fully see, and can never certify. And almost all the time, that is completely fine, because the foundations happen to be sound, and reality keeps correcting you when you drift. But nothing guarantees it. Nothing can. And there is at least one documented case, one of the clearest minds that ever existed, where the foundations quietly went wrong, and the reasoning stayed perfect, and the perfect reasoning walked the man straight off the edge. Before we follow Godel into the dark, I need to show you how far his blade actually reaches, because if you think all of this stays locked inside the seminar room, you have badly underestimated it. The limit Godel found is not a curiosity about arithmetic. It is the reason the device you are using to watch this can never do certain things, and it will never be able to do them no matter how fast processors get, or how large the models grow. That connection was made by a young Englishman just 5 years after Godel's paper, and his name was Alan Turing. In 1936, Turing was thinking about a question that sounds unrelated to incompleteness. He wanted to know whether there could be a definite mechanical procedure to decide any mathematical question, the third piece of Hilbert's dream, the one about decidability. To attack it, he had to first pin down what a mechanical procedure even is, and in doing so he invented, on paper, the abstract machine that would become the blueprint for every computer that has ever been built. A simple device that reads and writes symbols on a tape according to fixed rules. Everything your phone does, every calculation, every video, every message, is that machine, scaled up almost beyond recognition, but identical in its bones. And then Turing asked a Delian question about his own machine. Is there a program that can look at any other program, along with its input, and correctly decide whether that program will eventually finish or run forever? It sounds like it should be possible. It sounds like a debugging tool any programmer would kill for. Turing proved it can never exist. He proved that there is no general procedure that can decide, for every possible program, whether it halts or loops forever. And he proved it using the exact same weapon Godel used, self-reference. He imagined that such a halting detector existed, then built a program that asks the detector what it itself will do, and then does the opposite. If the detector says it will halt, it loops. If the detector says it will loop, it halts. The machine turns on its own description and contradicts it, and the whole thing collapses, exactly like the sentence that says it cannot be proven. The halting problem is Godel's incompleteness wearing the clothing of a machine. This is not a small or academic limit. It means there are questions about computer programs that are permanently, provably unanswerable by any computer. Not hard. Not unsolved. Impossible, in the same iron sense that G is unprovable. Every real limit on what software can verify about other software, every reason we cannot build a perfect virus scanner, or a perfect program checker, or a machine that automatically proves all our code correct, traces back to this. The entire field of computer science was born, in part, out of a proof about what computation cannot do, and that proof is Godel's proof in a new suit. The unreachable truth in arithmetic and the undecidable behavior of programs are the same phenomenon seen from two angles. Turing even acknowledged the debt directly, building his argument on the foundation Godel had laid. The next time someone tells you that a sufficiently advanced machine will eventually be able to answer any question, that there are no real limits, that it is only a matter of more data and more power, you are holding the counterexample. There are questions no machine will ever answer, and we have known it with certainty since the 1930s, and the reason is the same reason a formal system cannot prove its own consistency, and almost nobody who talks confidently about the limitless future of computation has ever traced the boundary back to the quiet Austrian who drew it. This is the foundation under the entire digital world, and its origin has been reduced to a footnote. And Turing, like so many of the figures in this story, was destroyed by the society he had served. He had helped break the German naval codes during the war, work that saved an incalculable number of lives, and after the war his country prosecuted him for being homosexual, subjected him to chemical treatment as an alternative to prison, stripped him of his security clearance, and broke him. He died in 1954 at 41 years old, in circumstances that have been debated ever since, but are widely understood as a suicide. The man who found the limits of the machine was ground down by a human system that could not tolerate who he was. It is the same shape again. The person who sees the deepest fault line is so often the person the world has the least room for. Godel saw it in mathematics, Turing saw it in computation, and both of them in the end were consumed by systems, one political, one internal, that they could see clearly and could not escape. Which brings us back to Princeton and to the slow closing of the trap, because by the time Turing died, Godel's own protective walls were already beginning to come down, one by one, and there were only ever a few of them. The first wall to fall was Einstein. In April of 1955, Albert Einstein died, and with him went the daily walks, the one human connection that had reliably pulled Godel out of his own head and into the shared world of conversation and sunlight and ordinary companionship. They had walked together for years. Now Godel walked alone, or did not walk at all. He was withdrawing further into the institute, into his office, into the interior country of his own reasoning, where he had always been most at home, and where, increasingly, no one could follow him. For a while there was still Oscar Morgenstern, the economist who had stood beside him at the citizenship hearing, and who now became one of the few people Godel would confide in as the decades wore on. And it is largely through Morgenstern's private notes that we can see with painful clarity what was happening to Godel from the inside during these years, because Morgenstern wrote it down as it unfolded. The way you might keep a record of a slow disaster you were powerless to stop. The fear of poison, which had first surfaced after Schlick's murder in the 1930s, was no longer an occasional shadow. It had become the organizing principle of Godel's physical existence. He was terrified of his refrigerator. He was terrified of gas leaks, convinced that the heating system might be releasing something that would kill him. He came to believe that certain doctors were conspiring against him. He wore heavy clothing regardless of the weather, still protecting the heart he had believed since childhood was failing, the heart that every examination found to be fine. And he was consuming a growing pharmacy of medications, laxatives and other remedies, self-prescribed for a body he was convinced was under constant threat. Monitoring his own physical processes with an obsessive, ceaseless attention that no evidence could ever satisfy. In January of 1970, something happened that shows how far the internal logic had progressed. Godel was hospitalized, and shortly afterward, in March, he telephoned Morgenstern and described his own condition in a way that is almost unbearable to read, because it shows a mind watching itself go and unable to intervene. He told Morgenstern that he felt he was under a kind of hypnotic spell, that he felt compelled to do the opposite of what he knew to be right. He knew. Some part of that extraordinary mind could still see, from somewhere, that the thing driving him was wrong, that his conclusions were leading him toward harm. And it did not matter. The seeing did not translate into the power to stop. He could observe the malfunction and could not reach the controls. This is the tragedy of a system that can model itself but cannot correct itself from the inside. The self-awareness was intact. The self-governance was gone. I want to be very careful and very clear here, because it matters, and because this is a real person and not a parable. What was happening to Kurt Gödel was a mental illness. The historical and medical record describes a man suffering from severe paranoia, a persecutory conviction of being poisoned, alongside the lifelong hypochondria that had shadowed him since boyhood. Later writers have suggested the pattern fits obsessive-compulsive disorder as well. This was not a philosophical position he adopted, and not a rational conclusion he reasoned his way into as a free choice. He was ill, and that illness deserves the same compassion we would give to anyone in the grip of an illness that hijacks the very organ they think with. I am drawing the parallel between his proof and his decline, not because his illness was a kind of logic, but because both his genius and his suffering ran through the same channel, the total, unbreakable trust in an internal chain of reasoning over the external world. That trust took him deeper into truth than almost anyone in history, and when the founding premise of the chain became the false and terrible conviction that the world was trying to poison him, the same trust took him somewhere no one could follow and no one could reach. Through all of it, there was Adele. For decades she had been the one fixed point, the person whose care could override, just barely, the machinery of his fear. She cooked for him. She tasted his food in front of him, so that he could watch and know it was safe, so that the internal alarm could be quieted by the one proof it would accept. As long as Adele stood between Godel and his terror, he ate, and as long as he ate, he lived. She was, in the most literal sense, the external check on a system that had lost the ability to check itself. She was the vantage point outside his reasoning that his reasoning could not supply on its own. And a system that depends entirely on a single external check has a terrible vulnerability, the same vulnerability that runs through this whole story. What happens when the outside check is removed? What happens when the one person who can verify the food is safe is no longer there to do it? By the mid-1970s, Godel's condition was accelerating. In February of 1976, he was calling Morgenstern 2 and 3 times a day, consumed by fear that he would be committed against his will, convinced his doctors were turning on him, a mind under siege from threats that lived inside it and wore the faces of the people trying to help. Morgenstern himself was now dying of cancer, watching his friend disintegrate while his own body failed, able to offer words down a telephone line and nothing more. And in the summer of 1977, Oscar Morgenstern died. The second wall was gone. Einstein, then Morgenstern. The two men who had anchored him to the shared world were both in the ground. There was only Adele left, standing between Kurt Gödel and the conclusion his reasoning had been building toward for 40 years. And Adele, by 1977, was herself gravely ill. In July of 1977, Adele went into the hospital. She needed serious surgery, and her recovery would keep her away from home for close to 6 months. And with that, the last external check was removed. The one person on earth whose food Kurt Gödel would eat, the one voice that could still, just barely, override the alarm screaming inside him that everything was poison, was gone from the house. She had held the line for 40 years. Now she could not be there to taste his meals, to sit with him, to be the proof his reasoning demanded. And without that proof, his reasoning did what it had always done. It followed the premise to the conclusion, with perfect, merciless consistency. The premise was that the food was poison. The conclusion was that he must not eat it. And there was no longer anyone present who could break the chain. And so, he stopped eating. Not all at once, and not as a decision in the way we usually mean the word, a weighing of options by a free mind. It was the output of a system running exactly as it had been running for years, now with the one thing that had been damping it taken away. Friends and colleagues tried to help. People brought food. It did not matter. The internal certainty rejected all of it. Every offering from the outside world was, to the logic that now governed him, simply another attempt to deliver the poison. The more the world insisted the food was safe, the more, in the grip of the persecution, that insistence could look like part of the plot. There was no argument from outside that could reach him, because his system had, long ago, classified all such arguments as exactly what an enemy would say. Think about the horror of that structure, because it is the second incompleteness theorem written in flesh. To be saved, Godel would have needed to step outside his own reasoning and check its foundation against reality. He would have needed to reach the vantage point from which he could see that the premise, the food is poison, was false. But that vantage point does not exist inside the system. It never did. It is the exact thing Godel himself had proven you cannot have. A system cannot certify its own soundness from within. It cannot get outside itself to check whether its axioms are true. And a mind, when its axioms have been corrupted by illness, is a system that has lost its outside. Godel had been his outside. The doctors could have been his outside. But his illness had reclassified every possible outside as part of the inside of the threat, and so there was no longer anywhere to stand from which the error could be seen. He was sealed in. Perfectly, logically, fatally sealed in. On the 29th of December, 1977, Kurt Gödel was admitted to Princeton Hospital. He weighed, by the estimate recorded at the time, about 65 pounds. He had reasoned himself down to the body of a child. He lived 16 more days. On the 14th of January, 1978, he died, sitting in a chair in his hospital room, curled into himself. The death certificate gave the cause as malnutrition and inanition brought on, in its clinical phrasing, by personality disturbance. The most rigorous mind of the 20th century, the man who had mapped the outer boundary of what reason can secure, had been killed by his own reasoning operating flawlessly on a broken foundation. He did not die because he could not think clearly. He died because he thought too clearly, from a premise that was wrong, with no way left to check it. His biographer, the logician who spent years reconstructing this life from the letters and the notes and the records, framed the final irony with a precision Godel himself might have respected. Unable to escape the inner logic of his own paranoia, unable to adopt what a logician would call a meta-theoretical perspective, a standpoint outside his own system from which the flaw could be seen. He succumbed to the very fear that had haunted him, and so his death both was and was not of his own choosing. He starved himself, yes, by his own hand in a sense, but the hand was being moved by an illness that had captured the machinery of his reason and pointed it, with all its formidable power, in the wrong direction. He was the author and the victim of the same flawless argument. Godel survived him. She had held him to life for 4 decades, and she lived on for 3 more years without him, dying in 1981. She left his papers, the vast archive of notebooks written in an obsolete German shorthand that scholars are still working through, to the institute where he had spent his American life. And in those notebooks, among the logic and the philosophy and the private proofs he never published, is the record of a mind that went further into the foundations of reason than almost any other, and that was, in the end, undone by the one limit it had itself discovered and could not, from the inside, escape. I have spent a long time with this story, longer than is probably healthy, and there is a part of it I still cannot settle. The part I cannot settle has nothing to do with the sadness of the death, sad as that is beyond easy words. It is the symmetry, the way the shape of the proof and the shape of the death fit together so exactly that you want to look away, because it feels like it means something, and you are not sure you want it to. Let me name the symmetry plainly, and then let me tell you why I think it has been allowed to stay hidden. In 1931, Godel proved that a sufficiently powerful formal system cannot, from within itself, prove that its own foundations are sound. It cannot step outside its own rules to check that it is not quietly building toward contradiction. To gain that certainty, it would need a vantage point above itself, and every such vantage point is just another system with the same limitation, and there is no top. In 1977, a sufficiently powerful mind, running on a foundation that illness had corrupted into the false axiom that the world was poisoning him, could not, from within itself, see that the foundation was wrong. To gain that sight, he would have needed a vantage point outside his own reasoning, and his illness had absorbed every such vantage point into the reasoning itself. The proof and the death are not a metaphor for each other. They are the same theorem, stated first about symbols, and then about a man. And here is what should genuinely bother you, the part I keep coming back to. This story, this exact convergence of the deepest result in logic with the most haunting death in the history of the field, is not famous. It is a footnote. Most educated people, if they know the name Godel at all, know a garbled slogan about mathematics being broken, and know nothing of the man, and certainly know nothing of how the shape of his end mirrored the shape of his work. One of the most extraordinary and terrible convergences in intellectual history has been reduced to a piece of trivia and a wrong summary, and I do not think that is an accident. I think the real story is avoided for the same reason Hilbert's program was quietly abandoned rather than loudly mourned. It is too uncomfortable to look at directly. The comfortable version lets you file Godel under clever paradox and difficult genius and move on. The real version asks you to sit with the possibility that the limit he found is not confined to mathematics at all, that it runs through every system that reasons, including the one reading these words, and that is not a thing people want to carry around with them. You can see the discomfort even in the reactions of the greatest minds of his own era. When the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the towering thinkers of the century, encountered the incompleteness theorem, he did not absorb it and build on it. He tried to wave it away. He wrote about it as though it were a kind of logical sleight of hand, a paradox to be dissolved rather than a result to be reckoned with, and his remarks on it are widely regarded, including by Godel himself, as simply missing the point. Godel was privately contemptuous, dismissing Wittgenstein's treatment as a trivial misunderstanding of what he had actually shown. Think about what that tells you. Here were two of the most powerful intellects alive, and one of them could not, or would not, look straight at the thing the other had proven. If Wittgenstein flinched, if Wittgenstein reached for a way to make it not mean what it means, what chance did the general culture ever have of absorbing it honestly? The result was too much, and so it got mythologized into something smaller and safer, a clever trick about self-reference, and the actual blade was wrapped in cotton and put away. But the blade is still sharp, and it is still pointed in a direction nobody wants to acknowledge, and I am going to turn it now toward the only place this story was ever really heading. Toward you. You are a system that reasons. Your brain takes in premises, applies inference, and produces conclusions and beliefs and actions, and the whole thing runs mostly below the level you can watch. And you are powerful enough to model yourself. You can think about your own thinking, you can reflect on your beliefs, examine your reasons, question your assumptions. That capacity for self-reflection is the thing we prize most, the thing we call wisdom, or insight, or self-awareness. But everything Godel proved says that this capacity has a hard flaw beneath it that it can never dig below. You can examine your beliefs using your reasoning, but you cannot step outside your own reasoning to check whether the reasoning itself is sound. Because whatever you would use to do the checking is more of the same reasoning. There is no view from nowhere available to you. There is no vantage point outside your own mind from which you get to confirm that your mind is working correctly. You are inside it. You are made of it. And a system cannot certify itself. Now sit with what that actually means in a life, because this is not abstract. And Godel is only the most vivid instance of something that touches everyone. Consider the premises you are running on right now, the basic assumptions about yourself, about other people, about what is dangerous and what is safe, about what you are worth, about what the world is like. You did not derive most of them. You absorbed them. From your childhood, from your circumstances, from experiences that wired themselves in before you could evaluate them, from an illness or a trauma or a story about yourself that you have never once questioned because it does not present itself as a story. It presents itself as simply how things are. And from those premises, whatever they are, your mind reasons forward, often flawlessly, often with real intelligence, to conclusions that feel not like conclusions but like plain perception of reality. And here is the part that should keep you up tonight. If one of those foundational premises is wrong, you will not necessarily feel it as wrong. A mind reasoning perfectly from a false axiom produces an experience that is indistinguishable from the inside from a mind reasoning perfectly from a true one. Both feel like clarity. Both feel like just seeing how things are. The person consumed by the certainty that they are worthless. The person locked inside an ideology that explains away every piece of contradicting evidence. The person whose grief has quietly rewritten the axioms of what they can expect from the world. The person in the grip of a delusion that recruits every fact into its own confirmation. None of them feel, from the inside, like they are making an error. They feel like they are the ones seeing clearly. The reasoning is airtight. That is exactly the problem. The reasoning was never the weak point. The premise was, and the premise is the one thing the reasoning cannot get behind. Godel is the extreme case, the pure laboratory demonstration. Because his reasoning was the most powerful and his premise, in the end, was the most starkly false, and the gap between the two opened into a chasm you could see from space. But the structure is universal. Every one of us is a consistent system reasoning forward from foundations we cannot fully inspect, and none of us can prove from the inside that our foundations are sound. The only thing that ever catches the error is the outside. Reality, pushing back. Other people telling you the food is not poisoned, telling you that you are not worthless, telling you that the thing you are certain of is not true. The external check is the only vantage point there is, because you cannot generate it yourself. You cannot be your own outside. And that is the cruelest part of the whole story, the part that closes the trap completely. Because the more corrupted the foundation becomes, the more the system reclassifies the outside as the enemy. The exact channel that could deliver the correction, other people, the pushing back of the world, gets flagged by the failing system as part of the threat. Godel came to see the people trying to feed him as the ones trying to poison him. The one thing that could have saved him was the one thing his reasoning had learned to reject. This is not just his tragedy, but the shape of the failure in all its forms. The isolation is not a side effect of the delusion. The isolation is how the delusion protects itself, by severing the mind from the only vantage point that could ever show it the error. The system does not just fail, it systematically dismantles the one bridge to the outside that could have caught the failure. I told you near the beginning that there was a question underneath all of this that never closes, and now you can feel the full weight of why it stays open. Can a system that reasons ever secure itself from the inside? Can a mind ever get behind its own foundations and confirm they are sound? Godel answered one version of that question with total finality. For formal systems powerful enough to describe themselves, the answer is no, permanently, provably, with no escape and no patch. What he could not answer, what nobody has answered, what may not be answerable at all, is the version that includes you. Whether the mind is a formal system in the relevant sense, and therefore falls directly under his blade, or whether it is something stranger that reaches past mechanism into territory no algorithm can enter. He left it as a fork, honestly, because he was too rigorous to pretend otherwise, and the fork is still standing exactly where he left it, and both roads out of it lead into the dark. If you are a machine, then the second incompleteness theorem holds you, and you can never prove your own reasoning consistent from within, and there are truths about yourself and your world you will never reach. If you are more than a machine, then you are something that exceeds any system you could ever write down or fully examine, which means you can never completely understand or verify yourself either, for the opposite reason. There is no branch of that fork where you get to be a mind that fully certifies itself. That mind is exactly the thing Godel proved cannot exist. And the proof does not care which branch turns out to be true. On every branch, the certainty you most want, the certainty that your own foundations are trustworthy, is the one certainty structurally denied to you. Not because you have not looked hard enough, because there is no place to look from. Go all the way back now to the boy in Bryn who could not stop asking why. Theorem, the child who wanted the reason underneath the reason, who kept digging past the point where the adults had answers, past the point where anyone had answers. Most children learn to stop digging. They hit a layer that feels solid enough, and they build their life on it, and they never ask what is underneath it. Godel never stopped. He dug all the way to the bottom of mathematics, and found that there is no bottom, only an endless regress of systems each unable to ground itself. Truth forever outrunning proof, every foundation resting on a deeper foundation that cannot certify the one above it. He found, in other words, the exact structure of his own question. The child who asked why forever grew into the man who proved that why goes down forever, that there is no final answer that answers itself, no ground that stands on nothing but its own soundness. He was looking for the bottom his whole life. His great achievement was the proof that the bottom is not there. And the same relentless descent that made him the deepest logician of the age is the descent that killed him. Because a mind that cannot stop asking why, that cannot rest on an unexamined premise, that trusts the internal chain over the external world with total and unbreakable commitment, is a mind with no brakes. When the chain led toward truth, it led further than anyone had ever gone. When the chain led, through illness, toward the conviction that the world was poison, it led there just as unstoppably, with the same refusal to accept any premise on authority, the same demand that reality answer to reason rather than the other way around. The engine that reached the deepest truth and the engine that reached the fatal delusion were one engine. There was never a way to keep one without risking the other. The reaching was the whole man. Remember Hilbert standing in Nigsburg saying we must know, we will know, the day after the young man in the audience had already shown that we cannot. Those words are carved on Hilbert's grave, a monument to a certainty that was already dead when the stone was cut. And I do not think they are wrong exactly. I think they are the most human thing we have ever said. We must know. We will know. The refusal to accept a limit on reason is the thing that built the entire modern world. Every discovery, every cure, every machine, every step out of ignorance and into light. It is the best thing about us, and Godel is the proof that it is not enough. That reason, followed all the way down, arrives at its own limit and cannot pass it. That the most rigorous thing we can do is prove, rigorously, that rigor cannot save itself. We must know. We will know. He knew, better than anyone who has ever lived, that we cannot. and he could not stop reaching anyway, all the way to the chair in the hospital room, still reasoning, still perfectly consistent, still trusting the chain over the world, right up to the end. I want to bring this into the room you are actually sitting in, because the fork Godel left standing is no longer a philosophy seminar. It is being tested, right now, in a way he could not have foreseen and would have understood better than anyone. We are building reasoning systems out of silicon, large machines that take in premises and produce conclusions, that can, in a growing sense, model themselves, examine their own outputs, reason about their own reasoning. And around them is a chorus of confident voices insisting that the limits are temporary, that with enough scale and enough data these systems will eventually answer any question worth asking, that there is no ceiling. Only the next order of magnitude. It is Hilbert's dream again, wearing new clothes. We will know. We will build the thing that knows. And sitting underneath all of that confidence, unmentioned in almost every breathless prediction, is the proof from 1931 and its computational twin from 1936. These systems are formal systems. Turing's result applies to them with full force. There are questions about their own behaviour that no such system can decide, problems that no amount of scale will ever crack, not because we have not built them well enough, but because the limit is in the structure of computation itself. A reasoning machine cannot, any more than a human mind or a formal system, step fully outside itself to certify that its own foundations are sound. It reasons forward from what was built into it, from premises absorbed during its training that it did not choose and cannot fully inspect, and it produces conclusions that are, when the foundations are good, often genuinely useful, and when the foundations are subtly wrong, often confidently, fluently, flawlessly wrong. A system reasoning perfectly from a corrupted premise produces output indistinguishable, from the inside, from a system reasoning perfectly from a true one. We are now building that structure at scale and handing it more and more of our decisions, and the people building it are, on the whole, no more able than Godel was to step outside the system and guarantee the axioms. I am not telling you the machines will starve themselves in a hospital chair. That is not the point, and it would be a cheap thing to say. The point is that the limit Godel found is not a quirk of one broken man or one abandoned mathematical program. It is a property of anything that reasons about the world and about itself, biological or mechanical, brilliant or ordinary. The dream of a system that fully grounds and certifies itself, that reaches every truth and proves its own reliability from the inside, is not merely unbuilt. It is unbuildable. It was ruled out permanently by a 25-year-old in 1931, and we keep forgetting, and we keep trying to build it anyway, because we must know. We will know. And we cannot make ourselves stop wanting the one thing that has been proven impossible. There is one more thing I need to say before the end, and it is about the woman who kept him alive for 40 years, because I do not want to leave you with only the cold geometry of the thing. Adele was not a logician. She was a dancer he met in a nightclub called The Moth, 6 years older than him, from the wrong side of respectable Vienna, disapproved of by his family, married before, warm in every way he was not, and she was, for 4 decades, the single point of contact between Kurt Gödel and the world outside his own reasoning. She tasted his food so he could watch and believe it was safe. She stood between him and the terror. She was, in the exact technical sense of everything we have been discussing, his meta-theoretical vantage point, the one place outside his system from which his system could be checked against reality. His mind could not supply that vantage point. No mind can. He needed a person to be it for him, and for 40 years she was. I think that is the truest and least abstract thing in this whole story. Because the theorem says, you cannot be your own outside. You cannot get behind your own foundations. You cannot certify your own soundness from within. And what that means, stripped of all the logic, is that every one of us depends, whether we admit it or not, on other people to be the check we cannot be for ourselves. The friend who tells you the story you have built about yourself is not true. The person who says, "That thing you are certain of, I do not think you are seeing it clearly." We are each other's vantage points. We are the only outside anyone ever gets. And that is a beautiful thing and a terrifyingly fragile one, because it means the moment you are cut off from the people who can see you from the outside, whether by illness or isolation or grief or the slow severing that pride and fear can perform, you are alone inside a system that cannot check itself, reasoning forward from foundations no longer touched by anything real. Godel had one outside left, and she went into the hospital in the summer of 1977, and the system closed over him like water. Let me take you back to where we started, now that you can see it for what it was. On the 29th of December, 1977, a man was carried into Princeton Hospital weighing about 65 pounds. You know now that he was not simply a sick old man. He was the person who had gone further into the foundations of reason than any human being before or since. He was the one who proved that truth is bigger than proof, that no system rich enough to describe itself can ever prove itself sound, that there is no final ground, no view from outside, no place to stand where the reasoning finally gets to certify itself. And he was dying of the exact thing he had discovered. He was a system that could not get outside itself, reasoning flawlessly from a foundation that had gone wrong, unable to reach the vantage point that did not exist, unable to see that the food was not poison, because seeing it would have required a standpoint his own theorems had proven impossible. He had drawn the map of the trap in 1931. 46 years later, he died inside it. He sat in a chair in that hospital room, curled into himself, weighing what a 9-year-old weighs, and on the 14th of January, he stopped. Malnutrition and inanition, the certificate said, caused by personality disturbance. The clean clinical words for a mind that had reasoned itself to death. And the terrible thing, the thing I still cannot fully hold, is that at no point did his reasoning fail him. It worked perfectly, all the way down. Given the premise, the conclusion was correct. Do not eat the poison. The premise was the only thing that was wrong, and the premise was the one thing he could never get behind. And here is what I need you to carry out of this, because it is not really about him. You are also a system that reasons. You are also running forward from premises you absorbed before you could examine them, foundations you did not choose and cannot fully see. You also cannot step outside your own mind to confirm that your mind is sound, because there is no outside available to you, because a system cannot certify itself, because Godel proved it and the proof includes you. Most of the time your foundations are good enough, and reality keeps correcting you and the people around you keep you honest, and you never have to know how little ground there is underneath the certainty. But the certainty feels exactly the same either way. That is the part that should stay with you. Clarity is not evidence. The feeling of seeing the truth is produced identically whether the premise is true or false. You cannot tell from the inside which one you are living in. Nobody can. He could not, and he was the smartest of us. The one defense is the outside, other people, the world pushing back, the voice that says you are not seeing this clearly. And the cruelest thing this story has to teach is that a mind coming apart at its foundations does not scream for that outside. It severs it. It reclassifies the people trying to help as the ones trying to harm. The correction and the threat start to look the same, and the system chooses to reject both. Which means the moment you most need someone to be your vantage point is the exact moment your reasoning is most likely to have decided they are the enemy. The bridge to safety and the bridge to the poison are the same bridge, and a corrupted system burns it precisely because it cannot tell them apart. Kurt Gödel spent his life proving that reason cannot secure its own foundations. And then he became the proof. He looked further than anyone into the structure of certainty and found, at the bottom, that there is no bottom, only the reaching, only the descent, only a mind following its own logic down past every flaw that was supposed to hold. He wanted the ground. His whole life was the search for the ground, and his single greatest achievement, the thing that will be remembered as long as anyone thinks about thinking, is the airtight proof that the ground he was looking for is not there. Never was. Cannot be. You are reading these words with a mind you cannot step outside of, reasoning from premises you not fully check, feeling a clarity that would feel identical if it were wrong. That is not a flaw in you, but the structure of being a thing that reasons at all. Godel proved it about mathematics, and it was the truth about him, and it is the truth about you. There is no view from outside. There never was. And the only thing that has ever caught the error is another person, standing where you cannot stand, seeing what you cannot see. Telling you the truth you have no way to reach alone. Hold on to those people. They are the only outside you will ever get. He did not have one left. And so the greatest logician who ever lived sat down in a chair, reasoned with perfect consistency from a single false thing, and did not get up.